He thought she was invisible, a background figure in a room that only valued voices like his. But he had no idea he was standing in the opening scene of his own downfall. The conference room on the 32nd floor gleamed with polished glass walls and a skyline, view stretching miles across the city, the kind of place where decisions shaped million-dollar outcomes and reputations were built or quietly erased. And at the far end of the long table sat Daniel Whitmore, perfectly composed in a tailored navy suit, fingers steepled, eyes sharp with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned for long. While across from him, barely within the frame of attention, Naomi Carter sat with a simple notebook, her posture straight but unassuming, her presence so quiet it almost blended into the hum of the air conditioning, as if the room itself had decided she did not matter. And maybe that was exactly how Daniel preferred it, because when Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm, precise, offering a solution no one else had considered, he didn't even let her finish, cutting in with a faint smile that never reached his eyes. "Let's stay focused on ideas that actually move the needle," he said, his tone light but dismissive, and a few executives exchanged glances, subtle smirks flickering before disappearing just as quickly, the kind of reaction that didn't need to be loud to be felt. And Naomi paused, her pen still in her hand, her eyes steady, not defensive, not embarrassed, just observant, as if she had seen this moment before, lived it enough times to understand exactly how it would unfold. And the room moved on without her, voices rising, strategies debated, her idea absorbed into the background without acknowledgement, without credit, without even a second glance. And for Daniel, it was routine, another meeting, another decision, another quiet dismissal of someone he had already categorized. But what he didn't see, what no one in that room could possibly see, was the shift happening in that silence. The moment Naomi closed her notebook with a soft, almost inaudible sound, not as surrender, but as conclusion, because while they returned to their polished discussions and confident projections, she had already decided something far more important, something that would not echo in that room until it was far too late. And as she stood to leave, unnoticed, unchallenged, unremembered, the glass walls reflected a version of her they couldn't recognize yet, one that wasn't invisible at all, just waiting, and somewhere between the city lights and the quiet hum of ambition, a different kind of story had already begun, one where success would speak louder than any voice they chose to ignore, and when it did, there would be no room left for doubt, only silence. The next morning, the office moved exactly as it always had, polished shoes crossing marble floors, quiet conversations blending into the steady rhythm of ambition. But Naomi Carter was already 10 steps ahead of a place that had never truly seen her, sitting at her small desk near the far corner where natural light barely reached, reviewing spreadsheets with the same calm precision she had shown in that meeting. Except this time there was no interruption, no dismissive voice cutting her off, only the quiet tapping of keys and the steady focus in her eyes. While across the floor Daniel Whitmore stood surrounded by senior managers, discussing a major client whose expectations were shifting faster than their strategies could keep up, his voice confident, controlled, masking the subtle tension beginning to form beneath the surface as projections no longer aligned the way they used to. And when one analyst hesitated during a presentation, Daniel stepped in sharply, redirecting the conversation with practiced authority. But the room could feel it. Something was off, something was slipping, and still, no one thought to look toward Naomi, even as she quietly finalized a set of numbers that told a very different story, one she had tried to share the day before, one that now sat neatly organized in her folder, unacknowledged and unused, until a junior associate, barely a year into the company, glanced at her desk and paused, noticing the depth of her work, the clarity of her projections, something far beyond what her title suggested. But before he could speak, a manager called his name and the moment passed, just another opportunity overlooked, just another instance of silence swallowing potential, and Naomi did not react, did not call attention to it, because she had already understood the pattern, already recognized that in a place where perception defined value, being unseen was not just a disadvantage, it was a limitation she could no longer accept. And as the hours passed, emails stacked, voices rose and fell, and pressure slowly tightened around Daniel and his team, Naomi closed her laptop again, this time with intention, not quiet acceptance, but quiet certainty, gathering her notes with steady hands, her expression unchanged, as if nothing had shifted at all, yet everything had. Because while the company scrambled to fix what they did not fully understand, she had already seen the outcome, already mapped the solution, and more importantly, already decided she would not be the one to hand it to them for free. And when she stood and walked past the glass offices, without a word, no one stopped her, no one questioned her, not even Daniel, who remained focused on a problem that was growing larger by the minute, unaware that the answer had just walked out of the room. And with each step Naomi took toward the elevator, the quiet hum of the office faded behind her, replaced by something far more powerful than recognition, something built in silence, shaped by every moment she had been ignored. And as the elevator doors closed, her reflection stared back at her, steady, composed, no longer waiting to be seen, because she no longer needed their permission to become unforgettable. By the end of the week, the pressure inside Whitmore Analytics had shifted from quiet concern to something far more urgent, the kind of tension that lingered in every hallway conversation and every late-night email. As the $2.3 million client they had counted on began pulling back, requesting revisions, questioning projections, and slowly losing confidence in a team that had always seemed untouchable. And Daniel Whitmore felt it, even if he refused to show it, standing at the head of another emergency meeting with the same controlled posture, the same sharp tone, but this time his words carried a subtle edge, a need to regain control that no longer came as naturally as before, while screens filled with data that did not quite add up, strategies that almost worked but never fully landed, and one by one, his team offered solutions that sounded polished but lacked something essential, something precise, something that could actually solve the problem instead of circling around it. And as the discussion dragged on, a quiet realization began to settle over the room, though no one dared to say it out loud, because admitting it would mean acknowledging a mistake they had all participated in, the moment they had ignored the one voice that had seen this coming. And Daniel paused mid-sentence for just a fraction of a second, his gaze drifting toward the empty seat Naomi Carter once occupied, as if his mind had finally connected a detail he had dismissed too quickly. But the moment passed just as fast as it came, replaced by his usual certainty, because someone like him did not second-guess, not in front of others, not when everything was on the line. And yet outside those glass walls, Naomi was no longer part of the problem they were trying to solve. She was building something entirely different, working late into the night in a small but focused workspace, her laptop glowing against the quiet hum of the city, refining a model that did not just fix what Whitmore Analytics was struggling with, but redefined it completely, her movements calm, deliberate, as if she had been preparing for this moment long before anyone else realized it existed. And while Daniel's team searched for answers within the same limits that had always defined them, Naomi had stepped beyond those limits entirely, not driven by anger, not fueled by revenge in the way they would expect, but by clarity, by the simple understanding that success did not need to announce itself loudly to be undeniable. And as she reviewed her final projections, the numbers aligned, with a precision that left no room for doubt, the kind of solution that would not just save a failing contract, but reshape how the entire industry approached it. And for the first time, the distance between where she had been and where she was going became unmistakably clear, because somewhere across the city, in a room filled with polished confidence and growing uncertainty, they were still trying to solve a problem she had already outgrown, and they had no idea how close they were to realizing exactly what they had lost. The following week did not begin with confidence. It began with silence, the kind that settled over conference calls when clients paused too long before responding, the kind that made even the most experienced executives shift slightly in their seats, as if something invisible had just tilted beneath them. And inside Whitmore Analytics, the urgency was no longer contained behind closed doors. It had spilled into every department. Every email marked high priority, every late-night message asking for updates that no one seemed able to provide with certainty. And Daniel Whitmore felt the weight of it more than anyone, even if he carried it with the same controlled expression, standing in front of a wall of projections that no longer impressed anyone, because the numbers told a story he could not easily redirect. a story of missed signals, overlooked insights, and a growing gap between what they promised and what they could deliver. And for the first time in a long time, his voice slowed. Just slightly, as he asked a question that lingered longer than expected. What are we missing? And no one answered immediately, because deep down they all knew the answer was not something that could be pulled from another report or another rushed analysis. It had already been there, already been offered, and quietly dismissed. And across the city, Naomi Carter sat in a different room entirely. One far less polished, but far more focused. Her workspace simple, a single desk, a second monitor, and a whiteboard filled with clean, deliberate lines connecting ideas that now moved with clarity and purpose. As she prepared for something much bigger than a single company struggle, reviewing her final presentation for the upcoming industry summit in Chicago, where leaders from across the country would gather to discuss exactly the kind of problem Whitmore Analytics was now failing to solve. And her name, once absent from every important conversation, was now printed at the top of the keynote schedule, not as an assistant, not as support, but as the voice introducing a new framework that challenged everything they thought they understood. And as she rehearsed quietly, her tone steady, her delivery precise, there was no trace of hesitation, no need to prove herself to anyone in that old room. Because this was not about being seen anymore, it was about being undeniable. And back in the glass office, Daniel finally received the confirmation he had been avoiding. The client had officially requested alternative proposals from external firms, a move that sent a ripple through the company. Sharp, immediate, undeniable, and for a brief moment, just a single moment, he leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on nothing, as if replaying every decision that had led to this point, every voice he had chosen to amplify, and every one he had chosen to ignore. And somewhere in that quiet reflection, a name surfaced again, clearer this time, harder to dismiss: Naomi Carter. And as the realization began to take shape, the distance between what he had overlooked and what he had lost became impossible to ignore. Because while he was still searching for a way to recover control, she was already stepping onto a stage where control was no longer his to claim. And when those two paths finally crossed, it would not be a conversation, it would be a moment that left no room for interpretation, only recognition. Chicago did not wait for anyone to catch up. The city moved with a rhythm of ambition and quiet competition. And inside the Grand Convention Center, under lights that reflected off polished floors and towering glass panels, the industry's most powerful voices gathered with the kind of confidence that came from years of being listened to. And for Daniel Whitmore, walking through those doors felt different this time, not unfamiliar, but unsettled, as if the ground beneath his certainty had shifted just enough to be noticed, his name still recognized, his presence still respected, yet no longer unquestioned. And as he took his seat near the front of the main auditorium, the large digital screen behind the stage cycled through speaker names and company logos, each one representing influence, innovation, and control, until it paused for just a second longer than the others, and a name appeared that made his expression tighten before he could stop it: Naomi Carter, displayed in bold letters above the title of a keynote that directly addressed the exact problem his firm was struggling to solve. And for a moment he remained still, his mind replaying every quiet dismissal, every overlooked contribution, every time her voice had been reduced to background noise. And around him, conversations continued, unaware of the shift happening in his awareness, until the lights dimmed slightly and a hush moved across the room, not forced, not announced, but natural, as if something important was about to begin. And then she walked onto the stage, not rushed, not hesitant, but composed, her presence filling the space in a way that did not demand attention. It commanded it, her posture steady, her gaze level, no longer confined to the edges of a room that refused to see her. And Daniel felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not disbelief, but recognition, the kind that arrives too late to change the outcome. As Naomi reached the center of the stage and paused, just long enough for the silence to deepen, before she began to speak, her voice clear, measured, carrying across the room with a confidence that did not need to prove itself. And as the first slides appeared behind her, outlining a framework so precise it immediately shifted the energy in the room, heads turned, pens moved, executives leaned forward, because what she was presenting was not just a solution, It was the solution, the one Whitmore Analytics had been searching for, the one he had dismissed without even realizing it. And as she continued, each point building on the last with quiet authority, Daniel sat motionless, the realization unfolding in real time, undeniable, irreversible, that the person he had once ignored had not only seen further than he had, she had moved beyond him entirely. And when she finally looked out across the audience, her eyes passing briefly over his row without stopping, it was not avoidance, it was acknowledgement without attachment, as if he no longer held any relevance in the story she was now leading. And in that moment, surrounded by a room that had fallen completely silent in focused attention, Daniel understood something he had never needed to before. That being powerful meant nothing if you failed to recognize value when it stood right in front of you. And by the time her presentation reached its turning point, the one that would redefine the conversation for everyone in that room, it was already clear that this was not a comeback, not a reaction, but the result of something built quietly, deliberately, far beyond the reach of anyone who had chosen not to see it. And there was nothing left for him to interrupt, nothing left to dismiss, only the weight of a mistake that had finally revealed its full cost. As Naomi's final slides settled on the screen, there was no immediate applause, no rushed reaction, only a deep, collective stillness that filled the entire auditorium. The kind that only happens when a room full of powerful people realizes they have just witnessed something undeniable. And for a few seconds longer than expected, no one moved, because her words were still echoing, her solution still unfolding in their minds with a clarity that left no room for debate. And then, almost all at once, the silence broke, not with noise, but with motion, executives leaning forward, exchanging looks, jotting notes with a new urgency, because what she had presented was not just impressive, it was necessary. And Daniel Whitmore remained seated in the center of it all, his posture unchanged, but his perception completely altered, watching as people who once dominated conversations now reacted to her work with the kind of attention he used to command. And for the first time, he was not leading the moment, he was witnessing it. And Naomi stood calmly at the front of the stage, not absorbing the attention, not seeking validation, simply allowing the impact of her work to speak for itself. Her presence steady, her expression composed, as if she had already moved beyond the need for recognition long before this moment arrived. And when the moderator stepped forward to thank her, the applause followed, strong but measured, not exaggerated, not performative, but genuine, built on respect rather than surprise. And as she stepped away from the podium, conversations immediately began to form around her, invitations, questions, opportunities moving toward her from every direction, while Daniel remained where he was, momentarily removed from the center of influence he had always occupied. And as he finally stood, his eyes followed her through the crowd, not with resentment, but with a quiet understanding that something fundamental had shifted, not just in the room, but in the balance of relevance itself, because the solution his company needed was no longer something he could control, it belonged to her now. And as the crowd began to disperse into smaller discussions, one of his own senior clients approached Naomi directly, their body language open, engaged, the kind of conversation that signaled interest at the highest level. And Daniel watched from a distance as she responded with the same calm precision she had shown on stage, not over-explaining, not overstating, simply presenting value with clarity. And in that moment, the reality became unavoidable. The gap between where he stood and where she had risen was no longer subtle. It was visible to everyone in that room. And yet Naomi did not look back, did not acknowledge the history that had brought them there, because she no longer needed to. And as Daniel took a slow step forward, considering whether to approach her, whether to say something that might close even a fraction of that distance, he hesitated, just briefly, as if recognizing that some opportunities, once missed, do not return in the same form. And the room, once filled with his voice, now moved around hers, leaving him with nothing to interrupt, nothing to dismiss. Only the quiet realization that the moment he had overlooked had become the moment that defined everything. The conversations around Naomi did not slow down. They expanded, branching into smaller circles of influence where decisions were quietly being reshaped in real time, and every question directed at her carried a different tone than the ones she had once been denied, not dismissive, not skeptical, but deliberate, as if each person understood they were speaking to someone whose insight now carried weight beyond titles or appearances. And Naomi answered each one with the same steady clarity, never rushing, never over-explaining, her words precise, her confidence grounded in results rather than recognition. While across the room, Daniel Whitmore finally moved forward, each step measured, controlled, but no longer effortless, because this was unfamiliar territory, approaching a moment where he was no longer the one setting the tone. And as he drew closer, he noticed something he had never taken the time to see before, the way people listened to her without interruption, the way the room subtly adjusted around her presence, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it. And for a brief second, he paused just outside the circle, watching as one of his former clients nodded in agreement with her analysis, their posture open, engaged, already leaning toward a future that no longer included his firm as the obvious choice. And that was when Naomi turned slightly, her gaze meeting his for the first time since she stepped onto the stage. And there was no surprise in her expression, no hesitation, only recognition, calm and complete, as if this moment had been expected long before it arrived. And Daniel felt the weight of it immediately, the absence of any need for validation, any need for acknowledgement, because she was no longer standing in a place where his opinion defined anything. And when he finally spoke, his voice lower than usual, more measured, he did not interrupt, he did not dismiss, he simply said her name, Naomi. And for a moment the surrounding conversation softened, not stopping entirely, but shifting just enough to acknowledge the exchange. And Naomi held his gaze, steady, composed, giving him the same space he had once denied her. And the silence between them carried more than words could. It carried every overlooked moment, every dismissed idea, every quiet decision that had led them here. And Daniel understood something then, something that no strategy meeting or executive briefing had ever taught him, that respect could not be reclaimed through authority. It had to be recognized when it mattered, and when it was ignored, the cost was not immediate, but it was inevitable. And Naomi did not need to remind him of any of it, because her presence was already the answer. And as the conversation around them resumed its flow, she spoke again, not louder, not sharper, just clear, continuing the discussion as if nothing had been interrupted, because for her, it had not been about proving anything to him. It had been about moving forward without needing his acknowledgement at all. And in that moment, surrounded by a room that had once echoed with his certainty, Daniel realized that the power he thought he held had never been absolute. It had simply been unchallenged until now. The moment did not end with that exchange. It deepened, stretching into something far more revealing as the room continued to orbit around Naomi Carter, conversations aligning with her ideas, decisions forming in quiet agreements that no longer needed Daniel Whitmore's approval. And for the first time, he was not the center of gravity. He was standing at the edge of it, watching influence move in a direction he could not redirect. And as the crowd shifted, one of the senior executives from a competing firm stepped closer to Naomi, extending a hand with a level of respect that was unmistakable. Their conversation brief but meaningful, the kind that signaled opportunity at a level far beyond a single contract. And Daniel saw it clearly, not just what she had accomplished, but what it meant moving forward. Because this was no longer about one overlooked idea. This was about a complete transfer of relevance, and the realization settled in with a quiet finality that left no room for denial. As another familiar face approached Naomi, a representative from the same client his firm had been struggling to retain, their expression open, engaged, already leaning toward trust, and Daniel felt the shift with a clarity that was almost unsettling. The understanding that the solution they had been chasing was no longer within reach, not because it was too complex, but because they had dismissed the person who created it. And Naomi continued speaking, her tone unchanged, her focus steady, never once referencing the past, never once drawing attention to what had been lost, because she did not need to. The room already understood, and that silence, that collective awareness, carried more weight than any confrontation ever could. And as Daniel stood there, he considered stepping forward again, saying something more, offering recognition that came too late. But the words did not come easily, not because he lacked them, but because he understood they would not change anything. And for a man who had built his influence on control and certainty, that realization was something he could not easily navigate. And so he remained still for a moment longer, watching as Naomi's presence continued to shape the direction of conversations that once would have been his to lead. And when she finally began to move toward the next engagement, guided by a group of executives eager to continue the discussion, she did not hesitate, did not look back, because there was nothing behind her that required her attention anymore. And Daniel exhaled slowly, a quiet acknowledgement of a shift that could not be reversed, understanding now that the cost of underestimating someone is not measured in the moment it happens, but in the moment when the world finally sees what you chose to ignore, and by then, it is already too late to step back into the position you once held. The convention center slowly returned to its usual rhythm, conversations dispersing into quieter corners, decisions already taking shape behind polite smiles and firm handshakes. And Daniel Whitmore found himself standing in a space that no longer responded to him the way it once had, the familiar sense of control replaced by something far more reflective, as if the room had subtly shifted its center and he was only now recognizing the distance. And across the floor, Naomi Carter continued, moving forward without hesitation, her path guided not by the need to be seen, but by the clarity of what she had built. Each conversation she entered carrying weight, each step reinforcing a presence that no longer required introduction. And there was no dramatic confrontation, no final exchange meant to settle the past, only the quiet unfolding of consequence, the kind that arrives without announcement but leaves nothing unchanged. And Daniel watched as the client he had once considered secure engaged with Naomi's team, their interest no longer tentative but committed, the decision already leaning in a direction he could not influence. And for a moment he considered approaching again, offering recognition, perhaps even acknowledgement of what he had failed to see. But the thought passed as quickly as it formed, because he understood now that timing mattered more than intention, and when the moment to recognize someone had passed, it could not be recreated on demand, and Naomi did not need to hear it, did not need to receive anything from him at all, because her success had already said everything that needed to be said. And as she paused briefly near the exit, surrounded by new partners and opportunities that reflected the work she had quietly built, she glanced once toward the space behind her, not searching, not lingering, simply acknowledging the path she had already outgrown. And then she turned forward again, continuing without hesitation, leaving behind a room that had finally learned to see what it had once ignored. And Daniel remained where he was, not defeated, not diminished, but changed, standing in the aftermath of a realization that would follow him far beyond that day, understanding that influence is not defined by how loudly you speak, but by how carefully you listen, and that the cost of overlooking someone is not always immediate, but when it arrives, it is complete. And as the doors closed behind Naomi and the noise of the convention resumed its steady pace, the lesson settled into the quiet space she left behind. Not spoken, not forced, but undeniable, that respect is not given to those who demand it. It is earned by those who never needed to ask for it in the first